It is time for the Finance Committee meeting of the Village of Lake Bluff. It's Monday, June 13th. Could we call the roll, please?
Member Rappin?
Here.
Member Ryder?
Here.
And Chair Anchorman.
Here. On the agenda is the first item, the approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which was May 9th, 2022. Does anyone have any comments, corrections, updates to make?
No.
No?
Do not.
Okay. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion carries. Next, we have allotted some time for any non-agenda items or visitors to this meeting. We've allotted 15 minutes for individuals who would like the opportunity to address the committee on any matter that is not listed on tonight's agenda. I do not see anyone here in the room who would be interested in speaking at this time. Do we have anybody, Drew, online or?
We do have one attendee. This individual has not raised their hand, so I think you're okay to move forward.
Great. Okay, next we have some business items for discussion regarding stormwater utilities. And this is just a quick summary of what we've done so far and where we are in the development. We've discussed feasibility and the determined the revenue requirements, which would be, in the ballpark of $50 million for new infrastructure. We've discussed some fee methodology and tried to break it down to what that might mean for an individual homeowner. And an average might be, $109 annually for a household at our, discussion level that we've been talking about. The billing rate might be on a quarterly or a bi-monthly basis. It could be with the water bill, it's my understanding. And we, in the May meeting, discussed some of who the key users might be. And we started the discussion of a program that would credit certain entities. And at this point, the work that remains would be that, at some point in time, we would bring in the community and have some community meetings, and then, create a recommendation for the village board as a whole to consider. So tonight, what we will be doing is we will be receiving a presentation from staff regarding the credit program, which we began discussing, and we asked for a little bit more hard work on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, our village engineer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I start, we do have two gentlemen here with us from Christopher Burke and Associates. We have Thomas Burke, who's, I think you've seen before, has been helping us with a lot of the utility, and Darren Olson is a vice president. Is that the title now? Darren first started looking at our viaduct flooding in 2014. So he's been looking at that longer than I have. We'll go through some information we have on credits, but if you have any other questions on the topic or for these two gentlemen, please feel free to pick their brains. They have a lot of experience and gone through other utility programs. And like I said, he's been at the viaduct for 8 years, so well familiar with the issues we have in Lake Bluff. So as Chair Ankerman said, we talked a little bit about a credit program last time we met about a month ago. Let's wait for the slideshow. So we'll review what we talked about last meeting, go over some additional information on credit programs. Our feedback we got from the last meeting is you want to see the full menu of credits that are out there. So we put together a couple of slides worth of a list of common and less common credits, and then we can have some Q&A. Review from last meeting is pretty quick. It's item 1, box 3. We had talked about a credit system modeling what Libertyville does, properties that do not discharge to the community system. We talked about a 50% credit for properties that don't really impact us. So we took that and we looked through probably a couple dozen other communities' credit programs and kind of came up with the 3 most common credits that really are the largest credits if you talk about percentage of credit versus your bill. 1, properties that have stormwater best management practices that meet or exceed standards for your development in the watershed development ordinance. So this would be properties such as Target, or modern, newly built, up to current standard. Some communities will offer staggered credits for older BMPs that maybe met the standard of the time but don't keep up with today. Some communities offer kind of a baseline. If you meet current standards and if you exceed it, then you get even more credit, kind of on a sliding scale. Properties with on-site stormwater storage. That could be as much as, some of our newer homes that have on-site that have been required as they built. And then we talked about before, properties that do not impact our system because they go directly to Lake Michigan, the Skokie River, or, some cases, the community has a quarry, it all drains internally. They usually get a pretty large credit. Most commonly, all these need to be filed by the owner needs to request the credit for the application. Sometimes there's a fee, $40, $50, some kind of thing. Supporting calculations, documents to show that you have met these standards that we talk about above. I say typically requires a PE signature that is more for the commercial, large scale, or full subdivision properties. Annual reports, you just need to see that they're continuing to maintain those as they were designed to continue to receive the credit. So there is the onus is on the credit receiver to keep us up to date and then reapply for credits every 3 to 5 years, just as a more full review to make sure that it still meets the standards and is operating correctly. Yes.
I have a question, Jeff, for you. So properties that do not discharge to the community stormwater system, does that mean that if a property discharged to a ravine, for example, as we have here, what would be such a property?
Some of our ravines we maintain because they're public property. So I like the one between Birch and Bluff is, some of that is on Lake Bluff property, so I would consider that part of our stormwater system. Some ravines that we do not do any maintenance on, so then I would consider them. And that's a little bit maybe deceiving because any water at all going to our system would not be eligible for that full credit. And most homes that back to the ravine have a front that maybe the front yard drains off to the street and then is picked up by our system. So there's not a whole lot of properties on a public street that would meet that criteria. It's more for, in Lake Bluff, it's things like Mariani Landscaping, which is between the railroad tracks and the Skokie River, or we have some properties that front DOT property that they maintain the storm sewer.
Cool, thank you.
I have a question as well. Can you give an example of best management practices, like when you talk about the best management practices? Just a couple examples, just ideas of.
So when we talk about the Lake County Watershed Development Ordinance, that's more commercial, like Target. They have that retention pond
Okay.
over by, is it a mattress store still, I believe? And that's really the only modern one we have. Tangley Oaks has detention ponds that aren't up to date, but those were designed to a certain standard. There's a application right now for the property kind of across the street from the Target pond to do some expansion in the future. They would have to put in an up-to-date detention pond as well. So it's more, you're thinking big detention ponds, or
So more commercial than
it's
residential?
generally is, if we had a new subdivision, like if Stonebridge ever developed into something fully, they would probably meet that standard as well.
Okay, thanks.
Jeff, are you talking about the liquid controls site?
I believe so, yeah.
So there is a pond, a substantial one on that property already. So in the case of properties like that where a pond, a detention or retention pond exists, they would have to update it to meet the BMP, or would they get
That
the
is
credit regardless?
Ultimately up to you all, because some communities will offer partial credit for things that are in place but are not up to standard. Some communities start credit at current standard, and then you can get more credit for exceeding the standard. That's wherever you want to put that scale.
So one of the things that I recall you saying at one of the previous meetings about credits, because I was making the argument about credits for homeowners who create rain gardens, et cetera, as opposed to something on a large scale like what Target or Liquid Controls did, is that for every credit we give, even though we want to encourage best management practices, that means that has to be made up somewhere else for us to achieve the goal, the monetary goal that we have. We have a number in mind, right, Barbara?
Right,
Yeah.
there
To
are,
the point of this is to debt service, right,
right.
ultimately. So can you or Bettina speak to that? Because I'm not saying Target or Liquid Control site isn't, or Mariani, but when we give, we have to get from somewhere, and it would seem that that burden would fall more heavily on residents. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, if you give out significant credits for commercial properties, then if you have the revenue that you are saying you need to do to service the debt, then yeah, you would probably end up raising the base rate. That is in a lot of the other documents of other communities as well, that you have to offset that. I don't know if you want to call it loss of revenue or not, but to meet your goal.
Just thinking of the equity and spreading this around, because if they're entitled to the credits, we don't want to burden our residents more because a commercial developer had the opportunity on a large scale to create something like that, that a resident couldn't because they're on a small lot.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing to just bear in mind is that, you know, some of the larger businesses or entities, you know, have tens of thousands of potential impact, where the average for a homeowner is 109.
Right.
So, I mean,
About a tank of gas these days, Barbara.
yeah, you're right. I saw that. You know, gas is about $6
Depending
a
on what you
gallon.
drive.
Exactly. So, you're right, and that's the hard thing. It's even when we waive fees for anything, you know, when we talk about fees and forgiving it, it's a big picture. Okay, so we don't get it here, and what does that do? And it's smart to think about that. It's smart to think about, okay, if we have this exception or this rule, what does that do to the big picture? And
Because we want to encourage what Target did, or the storage people to keep the development. I mean, I assume that part of that site plan includes, I recall, that pond remaining there. It has to,
We
doesn't
would
it?
need to expand upon it. You said we'd like to encourage, I mean, really they're meeting the minimum requirements
We
for
want that,
development. So
certainly.
that there really is no option for them to not do that.
Okay.
right.
No, you make a fair point. I was just thinking about how to, that tension, we want to encourage this BMP, but we don't want it to become detrimental. But Target will be netting us more money, so maybe we make up for it by earmarking some of that when they come off the 10-year agreement. You know what I mean? Like, sources and uses is what I'm thinking of in terms of how we can generate more funds that don't dip into residents' pockets every single time, because Target is going to become more of a boon to us than it is currently.
Yeah, and this overall schedule that's been being discussed and designed is presuming that there would be some new revenue stream, presumably stormwater utility, to supplement existing general fund expenditures, because this plan does assume there will be continued general fund expenditures, which is a lot of sales tax.
I mean, if you look at it, we haven't had a dedicated revenue stream that was for that purpose. So it has all come out of the general fund, and that does affect the whole pot that
Yeah.
is available for other things. And
Right.
so it's important that we're having this conversation.
On the previous slide, I buried the title a little bit. So you see this one says credits, it's credits that lessen the demand for municipal storm sewer capacity. So like the Target Pond, any kind of large development like that, you would consider that in designing the downstream storm sewer from there. We talk about smaller things on this next slide. We kind of broke into credits that do not lessen the demand for municipal storm sewer capacity. So these items you see here, we would not count on those living forever on private property. So when we would be designing a storm sewer, either they wouldn't really impact the design storm. You know, we talk about designing for the 10-year storm and the 100-year storm. Some of these things will help with smaller storms, but when it gets to a storm that large that we're actually designing for, it really wouldn't impact that. So when we talk about money for maintaining or improving our infrastructure, these items probably wouldn't impact how much that would cost, or some of the other ones may lessen that cost.
So it's not to say that these don't have a positive impact and that we don't want to encourage them. We do want to encourage them, but it's not going to move the needle in that instead of having an 18-inch diameter pipe, now we can only have a 16-inch diameter pipe, and we're going to save, $1 million. That's not going to make that kind of impact. is what
Some of
you're
these other things as well are more geared towards water quality and pollution control, which in some other areas there are, through the NPDES, National Pollution Elimination Discharge System permit, is required of the municipality. If you discharge to, say, a waterway that's considered impaired by metals or phosphorus, then you have to monitor those things a little more closely with water quality. We don't have any of that specific to Lake Bluff right now, so we really don't have that kind of benefit here, although there's nothing, wrong with cleaning the water where it goes in the lake or the Skokie, which is impaired by, I think, at least two things, but it's just not one where we are under requirements to clean up that water. So when we talk about, these are more residential things, rain barrels,
Right.
pavers, native plants. Green roofs are more commercial usually, but they really don't impact your storm sewer sizing. Even, you do a green roof, it's a small tray of dirt that fills up pretty quickly when it rains, and you end up just getting the same amount coming off the roof typically. It's more of a oxygen and, reflectivity sort of BMP. So we talk about these things that will not really lower our demand for storm sewer. It's a pretty similar process. Applications need to be filed, everywhere by the homeowner. The communities aren't going out looking for credits to hand out if the homeowner's not going to apply for them. Some sort of documentation is required. I took the line off about having a PE on this one because generally it's more of a drive-by. Yes, it's there. We can, know it's there. Annual reports still show up. You do want to know that whatever you're giving credit for is maintained year to year if you're going to continue to give credit for. And again, it talks about reapplying every 3 to 5 years. That seems to be pretty standard through all communities.
And the reference to a PE is a professional engineer,
Yes.
meaning it costs money.
It costs money.
It
It's
costs money.
more intense to
Yeah,
submit that kind of documentation.
exactly. And that's more likely to be done by a commercial entity.
I think Northbrook actually requires an engineer for residential credits.
Some do. Yeah, and that, to be honest, a lot of communities are intentionally hard to make that happen.
Right,
So
exactly.
some
Or
communities
like-
require you to deed the property as well.
Right, or the 100% threshold. I think I meet 98. I
Yeah,
literally
a little
do
bit of your
meet
driveway
98
comes
or
off
99
and
because
they will throw you
the
out.
rain garden I have is 3,500 square feet, so it's not your average small rain garden. But what you're driving at here is that while those slow the flow, the capacity eventually remains, because the event we're talking about is 100-year.
Or a 10-year, but that's still 4 inches of rain. in
Right.
24
Four-
hours.
It's 107 now?
7, 3,
At 7
5
inches,
maybe.
I think. Is it 6? 6?
Okay.
8.6,
something like that.
okay.
Yeah, whatever.
Right, I know it was just changed. So that's really the driving force that people need to understand too, is that the capacity is still gonna be the same amount of water ending up in the same place.
So our village design standard is a 10-year storm that the streets stay dry, and then a 100-year storm that we don't flood anybody's house.
I had a quick question about,
Can you please repeat what you just said?
sorry.
So the village's storm sewer design standard is a 10-year storm that the street isn't puddling, and during the 100-year storm, we don't have house flooding.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry.
No, thank you.
I just had a question. You mentioned earlier about a fee schedule for requesting a credit. So how do other communities do that? Like, let's say I come in, I'm a commercial enterprise, and I want to get some credits. Am I going to pay that fee to fill out the forms and apply for the credit once? Am I going to do that twice? I mean, I know that's a little kind of a little nitpicky. And then would residents be doing the same thing? Would they also have a fee? Because if you combine that with a professional engineer and what have you, now it's getting almost cost prohibitive to want to
Yeah.
do that.
And like I said here, like most communities that I've seen, you have to reapply for the credit. So if you did have an application fee, you'd have to redo that. But again, this is your program to design, so you can make it as hard or as easy as you want to get a credit.
Okay, but have you seen, though in other communities, is that a,
Some
guess I'm
communities have
asking
no
what other-
fees for permits. Some have, it's all over the board. I haven't seen one that was too high,
okay,
but, $40, $50, just something so people aren't basically giving you, unworkable documents.
thank you.
You want the next slide, Jeff?
Sure, yeah. So those were
Oops, wrong way.
next way. Credits that we see. Then there's some kind of unique things that we noticed going through a lot. I know there was questions about schools. As I mentioned earlier, the NPDES program, we are permitted by the state to discharge stormwater to waters of the state. Part of that permit requires education. So we have in the newsletter, we do stormwater things. We have other events where we'll talk stormwater at project meetings. So Champaign pretty much, I think, probably wipes out the school bill by offering $5 per student, and that's how they get around that. I mean, it's legally, and Peter's not here, but it is hard to give free pass to non-taxpayers because this is a fee and not a tax. so it's supposed to be a user fee. Wilmette offers just a straight up 25% credit, but then 501c3 includes schools, parks, cemeteries, churches, pretty much everything. They just have a straight up 25% credit. Wilmette also does something interesting. We talked about offsetting, with more higher base rate. They say up to $70,000 is all they're going to give in credits. And then I don't know if they line up on New Year's Eve at Village Hall or what there to get their credits, but it's possible you would be too late. It is to be noted too, I think a lot of communities have credit programs that are not as widely used as they could be. And maybe that is education, maybe that's just, it's a hassle for homeowners and people to keep up on that. But I don't know if Wilmette actually hits that cap.
I have a question about on the second point, institutional zoning districts. Do we have such thing like Bluff with schools?
We have the Rio district.
Residential, institutional,
Open
and open
space.
space,
Yeah.
which includes village properties, park district, schools.
The library, churches.
And have we calculated what the impact would be?
We have,
on the
as part of that, we can go back to that slide.
It's buried in the back there
Yeah,
somewhere.
we can go,
Okay.
We have
but
looked
the
at-
answer is yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, are we going to get to that? I mean, are we going to review that or no? I know
If
that,
you'd like to, it's in.
I think we should because
this
the question
slideshow
came
is-
up.
Is all the new slides.
Almost done.
Yeah,
then
I
we'll
know,
get
and it's
everything
awesome. It's so awesome. I just didn't want to lose that train of thought
I've written it
because,
down. We'll go back to that slide.
thank you.
I just think it's ironic to offer credit to institutions that have the most impervious surfaces. Kind of runs contrary to the whole concept of the, do you know what I mean? I mean,
Well-
if you think of a church, that, I'm just
parking
using
lot,
that as, it's almost entirely parking lot and building.
I think that when it comes to those larger users, we do look at that specific user, as opposed to applying the R1 standard for, an ERU of
Right.
1, even though some are slightly bigger and some are slightly smaller. It's my understanding that when we get to those larger users, we would, craft something that's a little more tailored to what their actual property is. Is that right?
I don't even know. Drew, do you know, is the train station lot in Rio or is that zoned something else?
It is.
Okay. So that's one that, that definitely impacts our storm sewer demand.
For sure.
But under, a similar thing, if they get a credit just for being institutional or,
Well, and that's a
Whatever they are.
program that we can we can tailor ours to include something like that or not, right? That's what everything's all on the table to see what other entities have done and see if this is a Lake Bluff good fit.
then the last bullet point there, like Towners Grove and a couple other communities will just pay, it's an incentive program versus a credit. It's a one-time fee. The $25 was for somebody to put in rain barrels, $300 was more for a rain garden or permeable pavers. That avoids the billing kind of, I have this bill and this bill, it makes it easier to bill, have everybody have the same, but yet still incentivizes the behavior.
And I appreciate that type of approach because it's kind of a do the work once, figure it out, and then we don't have to keep revisiting it and having the staff time, and it just seems to be a more efficient, in my opinion, that's a more efficient use of our time, yet still rewarding that, end result that we want to
Avoids the
see.
annual, it's a couple hours annually
Yes.
to review those things for a
Exactly.
$40, $50 credit or even less than that. It is
Exactly.
eating staff time.
But again, that's something that we can decide.
So that was the full menu. I don't know if you want to find that slide that Trustee Rappin was referring to with how much we had figured coming from each zoning district. But
And so to Barbara's point, we do not have an obligation to have a format for credits. It needs to be, this is free form. We can decide anything we want at this point. Or do we have constraints on these programs?
legally, I believe we have to have a appeals process. I do not believe we have to have a credit process, but I would defer to Elrod and Freeman about that.
We did mention that trying to limit our exposure to litigation from, people who may say, oh, I have this user fee now, we didn't have it before, I'm going to, go down this road, and I do remember that not having a credit program of any sort would, some entities have been litigated against. And we want to take that into consideration, that whatever we do, we want to limit our exposure to litigation.
Challenges, yes.
Yeah, to challenges, yeah.
Thank you.
Are those entities historically commercial?
I remember that it was, you know,
Some
like,
residential, some commercial.
right, and it was, I think, Wilmette and,
Peoria.
yeah, those were the two entities that had been mentioned by Peter, so I don't know the specifics, other than that's,
I can see that,
yeah.
Well, it was
particularly.
Winnetka and Peoria. You were-
Right,
Oh, Winnetka.
Winnetka, west of anyone in the business park, and that's a different watershed, right?
I don't know Winnetka geography that well.
No, I'm sorry, us.
Oh, Than us.
Anything west of
Bay.
41.
Green Bay.
Yeah, Green Bay.
Green Bay.
Or Green Bay is the Continental Divide, so that's I can see that being an issue. And if that's the calculus in order to avoid costly litigation, then that may be the case.
I guess we're done. I'm just still trying to understand, like, we need X amount of dollars in the pot to do the debt service. So if we start handing out credits, which I'm not opposed to because I think it compels people to think differently and educate themselves, and it changes behavior. So I think that's great from that standpoint. But we still need X amount of dollars in the pot. So I think that's a piece I'm struggling with. How, if we decide, let's say we decide to do the 25% off for the 501(c)(3)s in the Rio district, then how are we gonna recapture that additional 25%? Because we're gonna need it.
Well, the variables that you can change are take on larger debt, or have a longer window for when we have enough to move forward, or obtain grants and other funding, so that what we're doing is providing a source as we continue to need new, stormwater projects. We've created funds to provide for that, because those needs don't go away. So I think it's important that we understand that we've got to figure out what level we're comfortable with, given this big pot of need, right? And then as we continue the conversation, we may find other sources of funding. We may, we've chopped it up into different segments where we say, here's our initial leg of what needs to be done, and then here's a piece that feeds into it, and here's another piece that feeds into it. So we have to just look at it as chunks that we can bite off at a time. And unfortunately, that big trunk we have to do first, or anything else can't feed into. It's all too tight.
One other variable that we shouldn't forget about is that we've set 109 as our average ERU, or one.
For a household?
Yeah, per household. That number goes up, sort of like property taxes. When one person's property tax goes down due to an appeal, we don't collect less dollars.
You're right.
The dollars of the other households fill in the gap, right? So while you're right, we can adjust other variables. I think that's the natural one that comes to mind. It has to come from somewhere, right?
Well, I'm just saying that if we choose $10 million versus $20 million to bite off,
Yes.
that is a big lever,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I should add that 109 is outdated already, because that was
Oh,
from last
yeah,
fall.
yeah.
And
But
the
it-
interest rates have gone up. I don't remember what number that
Right.
wouldn't be
Bettina
the same
knows.
thing as that.
But Tina knows.
As of a couple weeks ago, it was like $40,000.
But if we break it down to per household annually, right? I mean, are we looking at a 20% difference, a 10% difference? I mean,
That was my question.
Yeah.
so there's about, 12%.
In my
more.
recollection, the general idea was that's still not a lot of money. I mean, it's more money. There's nothing, I mean, it's not to be taken lightly. It's
Right,
just
and
more.
the economy is doing what the economy
But
is
as you
doing.
point out, relative to a tank of gas today, right, it's still.
Right, I don't want to
Yeah.
minimize that, because we're
Yeah.
looking at 250 basis points in, and I realize municipal bond lending is different, but we're 250 basis point increases and then by the end of July.
Yeah.
the reason I mention that is not the debt servicing of this, but what it's gonna do to people. I never want to minimize, and I know you're not, but it's still, and then the possibility that there'll be this creep up like a funicular going up a hill really, and eventually it gets to Winnetka, and it's 240, and then it's 300, and then the price of the project increases, and meanwhile, property taxes are going up. And if we're talking about credits to avoid litigation, the less litigious groups are residents versus big corporations that are here, that are not based in Lake Bluff and are just, more inclined to not think twice about suing in a community they don't live in.
And that's why I think it's great when we have Peter as a resource to kind of guide us in that way.
Sure. But I do think that that's just something, so we just keep going back to the same well, and that's residents. So I'm sensitive to that. In the current economy, I just think we have to be super sensitive to that, not indicate that, because I'm curious to know what Bettina's going to say about interest rates for this particular debt in terms of where they are and where they might be by the time we get around to this. I'd love to know what your thoughts are, because is this number even relevant anymore?
The 620 number isn't, it would be more inside of 50.
So not to interrupt, but that the WHEN, the win question mark, we had the kickoff meeting this morning about the phase one. And so the idea, the timeline of when that